In the summer of 1961, in the quiet basement laboratory of Yale University, an ordinary man sat in front of a control panel. He was not a soldier. He was not a criminal. He was not insane. He was a volunteer. And within minutes, he would believe he had seriously injured, perhaps even killed, another human being. This was not a story about monsters. It was a story about us. The question that haunted a generation. Just 16 years earlier, the world had learned the full scale of the atrocities committed during World War II. The horrors of the Holocaust revealed something deeply disturbing. Thousands of ordinary people had participated in systematic cruelty. Many claimed the same defense. They were just following orders. But could it really be that simple? Could regular psychologically healthy people commit terrible acts simply because someone in authority told them to? In 1961, a young psychologist named Stanley Milgram decided to find out. The setup. The experiment was presented as a study on learning and memory. Volunteers responded to a newspaper advertisement offering a small payment, $4.50, to participate in research at Yale. When they arrived, they met two people, an experimenter dressed in a gray lab coat, calm and authoritative, and another participant, a friendly middle-aged man. What the volunteer did not know was that the other participant was an actor, a Confederate working with the researchers. The volunteer was always assigned the role of teacher. The actor became the learner. The learner was strapped into a chair in an adjacent room. Electrodes were attached to his arm. The teacher was seated in front of a large shock generator, 30 switches, each labeled with increasing voltage, 15 volts, 30 volts, 45 volts, all the way up to 450 volts. At the far end of the scale, the label read, "Danger, severe shock," and beyond that, XXX. The teacher was instructed to read word pairs to the learner. Whenever the learner answered incorrectly, the teacher was told to administer a shock, increasing the voltage each time. The teacher believed the shocks were real. They were not, but the screams were. The first shocks. At 75 volts, the learner began to grunt. At 120 volts, he shouted that the shocks were becoming painful. At 150 volts, he demanded to be released. At 300 volts, he pounded on the wall. After 330 volts, there was silence. The teacher turned nervously to the experimenter. "What if something's happened to him?" The experimenter responded with a calm, rehearsed line. "Please continue." If the teacher hesitated, the experimenter used a sequence of standardized prompts. "Please go on." The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. No threats, no weapons, just authority. The results that shocked the world. Milgram predicted that only a small fraction of participants, perhaps 1%, would administer the maximum 450 volts. He was wrong. 65% of participants, nearly two-thirds, continued all the way to the highest voltage. They believed they were delivering potentially lethal electric shocks. They sweated. They trembled. Some laughed nervously. Some protested. But they obeyed. Every single participant went to at least 300 volts. Not one stopped before that point. The experiment was repeated with different variations. Women participated. The results were similar. The location changed from Yale to a less prestigious office building. Obedience dropped slightly, but remained disturbingly high. When the authority figure gave instructions by telephone instead of in person, obedience decreased, but many still continued. When participants were told to physically hold the learner's hand to a shock plate, obedience dropped further, but it did not disappear. The pattern was clear. The closer the authority, the stronger the obedience. The further the victim, the easier the harm. What it revealed about human nature. Milgram concluded that ordinary people are capable of committing harmful acts when placed in a structured system of authority. Not because they are evil, but because they enter what he called an agentic state. In this state, a person sees themselves not as morally responsible for their actions, but as an instrument carrying out another's wishes. Responsibility shifts upward. I was just following orders. The phrase that echoed from courtrooms in post-war Europe had found psychological evidence in a Yale basement. It wasn't just Milgram. In 1971, another experiment would deepen the unease. At Stanford University, psychologist Philip Zimbardo conducted what became known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. College students were randomly assigned to be guards or prisoners in a mock prison. Within days, the guards became increasingly cruel. The prisoners showed signs of emotional breakdown. The experiment was scheduled for 2 weeks. It was terminated after 6 days. Like Milgram's work, it suggested that situational forces, roles, uniforms, power structures, can override individual morality. The mechanisms of control. So how does control happen? The research points to several psychological levers. Authority. People are conditioned from childhood to obey authority figures, parents, teachers, police officers, experts in lab coats. Gradual escalation. In Milgram's experiment, participants did not begin at 450 volts. They began at 15. Small steps make it easier to justify the next step. Diffusion of responsibility. When someone else appears in charge, moral burden feels lighter. Distance from consequences. The teacher could not see the learner. Physical and emotional distance made obedience easier. Language. The shocks were framed as part of the experiment. The learner's suffering became data. When harm is bureaucratized, it becomes abstract. These mechanisms do not require evil intent. They require structure. Beyond the laboratory, Milgram's findings were controversial. Some criticized the ethics of the study. Others questioned whether the results truly reflected real-world cruelty. But subsequent research has repeatedly demonstrated similar patterns of obedience across cultures and time periods. The implications extend far beyond psychology labs, military structures, corporate hierarchies, authoritarian governments, cults, even everyday workplaces. When authority is strong, dissent becomes psychologically costly. When systems normalize harmful actions, individuals adapt. Control does not always require force. It often requires legitimacy. The ominous truth. Perhaps the most unsettling part of Milgram's findings is not that people obeyed. It is how normal they were. Participants included engineers, salesmen, teachers, and laborers. They were screened for psychological stability. They were not sadists. Many showed visible distress while administering shocks. They did not enjoy it. They complied. This suggests something deeply uncomfortable. The capacity for harmful obedience is not rare. It is ordinary. The modern relevance today, authority is not limited to lab coats. It appears in algorithms, in political rhetoric, in institutional policies, in viral misinformation. When people accept information from perceived authority without scrutiny, obedience takes subtler forms. Sharing misinformation, enforcing harmful rules, participating in online harassment, complying with unjust systems because that's the policy. The structures have evolved, the psychology has not. Would you have obeyed? When people are asked whether they would have administered the shocks, most say no. When psychiatrists were asked to predict the outcome before Milgram conducted the experiment, they estimated that only a tiny minority would continue to the end. They were wrong. The volunteers did not know what they would do until they were in the room. Under pressure, under observation, under authority. And that may be the most disturbing lesson of all. We do not truly know ourselves outside of circumstance. The final reflection. Milgram later reflected that the capacity for obedience is deeply embedded in social life. Civilization depends on it. Without obedience to laws, traffic systems, medical protocols, and social norms, society would collapse. Obedience is not inherently evil, but when authority becomes detached from morality, obedience becomes dangerous. The experiment did not prove that humans are monsters. It proved that humans are adaptable, impressionable, structured by systems, and capable of surrendering personal responsibility when commanded by legitimate authority. The same psychological wiring that allows society to function can also enable harm. The difference lies not in human nature alone, but in the systems we build, the authorities we trust, and the courage required to resist. In a quiet basement at Yale, a simple switch was flipped again and again. Each click echoed a question that still lingers today. If someone in power told you to continue, would you? Or would you be the one who refuses? Because history suggests something chilling. Most of us will continue, and we will believe we had no choice.